Well, again, welcome, Dr. Cawley, and thank you so much again for agreeing to talk with this class. For background, for people who aren't familiar with Dr. Cawley, he's a professor of political science at University of Wyoming, specializing in political conflict and environmental and public administration contexts. He got both his master's and PhD at Colorado State and taught political science at the University of Montana prior to the University of Wyoming, where he's been since 1987. And like Dr. Freemuth, Dr. Cawley is a respected expert in federal lands policy. In addition to numerous articles, book chapters, media interviews, he's also the author of Federal Land, Western Anger, the Sagebrush Rebellion, and Environmental Politics, and the co-editor of A Wolf from the Garden, the Land Rights Movement, and the New Environmental Debate. His book on the Sagebrush Rebellion is highly recommended resource and explores the social, historical, and political context of the Sagebrush Rebellion in the 70s and 80s, particularly the emergence of calls for federal land transfers to the states, the impact of the Federal Land and Policy and Management Act, and conflicts between environmental groups and traditional land users over multiple use. It'd be particularly useful for those students trying to gain a further understanding of current conflicts over federal land use. As Dr. Freemuth always told me, the Sagebrush Rebellion wasn't a one-time event, and it reemerges every, I forgot how many years, but consistently reemerges. But I'll let Dr. Cawley tell you how they met, but I know Dr. Freemuth highly respected him, considered him a friend. As just based on my brief research, they co-authored at least 6 articles in a book chapter together, or probably more that I missed. And in fact, Dr. Freemuth referred to Dr. Cawley's book in his testimony to Congress last September on the BLM headquarters move, especially when explaining the importance of BLM's history in the context of current conflicts. So again, welcome, Dr. Cawley, and I will turn the screen over to you.
I have one quick interjection here. We didn't go over the Zoom rules in case we have new guests in the audience, but we just ask that everybody stay on mute if you're not talking. We do encourage you to use the chat box to keep a running list of questions as you think of them, especially for students. Can be useful. And then if you have a video and you are listening, it's nice to see your beautiful faces. So if you could turn those on, if they work, it makes for a little bit friendlier of an atmosphere. If you don't, or if you're doing laundry or whatever else while you're listening in, then that is fine too. That we don't object, but it is nice to see the reactions and the active listening, especially that all the students are doing. Wonderful. Proceed, please, Dr. Cawley.
Thank you, Mackenzie. I guess where I'm going to start here. John and I had an ongoing disagreement, I'm going to call it. I'm a McGregor. I'm a Highlander. John loved the desert. He was a lowlander. And so we used to argue about the relative difference between the highlands and the lowlands. What I used to tell him was that one of the nice things about the highlands is, with the exception of ticks and mosquitoes, basically everything that might bother you comes pretty big, as opposed to the desert where there are scorpions and snakes and things scurrying around. I could never feel comfortable sleeping on the desert floor. And so I find out that John's actually was helping you with Scottish Highland dissertation. So, well, thank you all, and thank you. I think this is a wonderful thing that Emily and Mackenzie have put together for John. I'm sure he would appreciate it, except as I was explaining to Mackenzie, maybe some of you heard, John, fortunately, as it turns out, I invited John to talk to my federal land politics class about, I forget now, about 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks before his death. And it was Zoom like this. And afterwards, he and I were chatting about it, and he was quite vocal in the notion that he did not like this form of teaching. So it's a touch ironic that we would be honoring him in this fashion, but I'm sure he would appreciate it. Well, I don't know where to start exactly. John and I have been friends now, oh my, forever, it seems like. I received the first PhD in political science awarded by Colorado State University. Yeah, I know. It wasn't that long ago, actually. So a friend of mine says this is Arctic blonde, in case, you know, it comes up again. This is my Arctic blonde hair. But I received my PhD in '81. And then I had my first teaching job, which was actually here at Wyoming. It's a strange story. Well, I was hired on a one-semester contract. It was my first job out of graduate school, and here at Wyoming. My official title in those days was Supply Assistant Professor. I have no idea where they came up with that, but I had the marvelous mental image of a big warehouse somewhere where they had all of these PhD people sitting in shelves. And so then the political science department would call up and say, we need a political science professor. And they'd come and with a forklift lift you off. Okay. So you're going to be a hard crowd. That's okay. I can deal with hard crowds. But anyway, so one afternoon I'm sitting there in my office staring out the window and the phone rings. Right? And I answer the phone, and on the other end of the phone is this fellow named John Freemuth, who had just started the PhD program at Colorado State and had been told that I might be a good person to get some background from. I won't go into details, but in those days, the political science department at Colorado State, as one of my professors put it, was about as factionated as a department could be and still remain a single department. I'm serious. I mean, they had factions, and faculty members would look out into the hall to make sure that the other side, there weren't people from the other side out there before they'd leave their offices. Anyway, might add, it was fun trying to be a graduate student in that kind of an environment. But anyway, John and I had, I bet we must have talked, this was landline telephones. Do you remember those? Right? They had, connect to the wall. Right? But we must have talked for an hour or so. The advice I gave him was what I had figured out on my own, and it was good advice. The one person in the political science department that no one would go against was this fellow named Philip O. Foss, who wrote one of the classics in federal land politics, Politics and Grass. And I don't know if you've had classes with John, but Foss, or Poff, as we always called him, P-O-F, Poff, always used to tell us, well, his book was the most frequently checked out and quickly returned book at the Harvard Law Library. Something about how at Harvard, grass meant something other than grazing. But I had worked this out on my own, that, when you're in a contentious department, see if you can hitch your wagon to the person that no one's going to go against, because that means if they're going to do stuff to you, they're doing it against him, and it worked out well. And so I told John he had to hitch his wagon to Poff as well, and he did. As John and I like to say, I was Foss's first PhD student, and John was his last. It turns out the Foss had been working to set up the PhD program at CSU for, 10, 15 years, and finally succeeded. And as I recall, I think John was the fifth PhD, right? So, but by that time, Foss, after John got his degree, Foss retired. So, but anyway, so that's how we first met, quote unquote. We didn't physically get together until about a year later. One of our one of the graduate students at CSU that had been there when I was there and was still there when John got there. That happens a lot to graduate students. Sometimes it becomes a career. Don't worry, Mackenzie, you'll get done. You'll get done. But anyway, he got married and invited John and I to his wedding, and that's where John and I first met, interestingly enough, in Estes Park, Colorado. So it was all outside. John and I then struck up an acquaintance, and John got his degree and went off to Boise. And, you know, we spent years and years working together. Turns out, over the past few years, John and I kind of drifted down different paths. And I'll talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. Emily or Mackenzie, would you keep track of time for me? College professors and lawyers always use the term brief and never are.
Yep, we can do that.
As I tell students in my seminars, I am perfectly capable of talking for a solid 3 hours and will do so unless they stop me. So anyway, John and I worked together for years, but as I said, over the last few years, we kind of drifted apart, at least in terms of our research. But we've kept in touch, as I say, over the years. John and I have gone to multiple conferences together, and I don't think he would disagree with what I'm about to say, but probably some of the best work John and I did together until sitting in a bar and talking about stuff. In fact, well, you know, I don't want to talk out of school, but my experience has been most of the really important stuff at academic conferences does in fact occur in the bars, not in the panel sessions and formal stuff. But anyway, John and I both share a love of gin. We also both had a fascination for different reasons with Las Vegas. Maybe some of you know this. John loved Las Vegas. I tell you, one of the most amazing things about John, he could get into slot machine consciousness. I mean, it was uncanny. Right? I remember I went to a conference watching him playing a $1 slot machine. And he put $1 in, he'd pull the arm down, and he would predict exactly what was going to happen. And he did that for the better part of an hour. Fascinating stuff. But, you know, we were just having fun. Well, you know, I've got numerous stories about John. Well, I'm going to say one other. One year we went to the American Society of Public Administration, which is the big national public administration conference. And well, suffice it to say, most of the people who go to ASPA are, well, I'll be polite. John and I don't fit in comfortably with most of that crowd. Right? And so we would go and have fun. But one year they would have these name tags, and then they had these ribbons for, you know, various, I don't know, offices or something in the organization. And so there are all these people walking around with their name tags that have ribbons hanging down. Well, John and I were talking before the conference about this, and quite frankly, we were smirking about it. So what John proposed, and we did, we went down, you know, to Walmart or whatever and got some ribbon and put ribbons on our name tags, right? Just to see if anybody was going to stop us and ask us what our ribbons were about. Right? So John was a bit of a trickster, a coyote type. So, but as I say, I could go on and on about John. One wonderful, wonderful times we had together. I'm sorry, I'm not good at this. I just noticed that there was a chat thing, and so I'm going to move this over here to the side, try and sort of pay attention. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about federal lands. All right, and see, John and I both worked in the area of federal lands, but we actually had different but actually compatible foci here. John was really, really interested in federal lands per se. My interest was about the politics. Okay? And so that would explain why, and more recently, our paths kind of diverted, because John stayed way more active in federal land stuff than I did, because I was off, I've been off doing other kind of political study types. And I'll explain that a bit more here. But so when I was in graduate school, right, there was this question of what kind of a dissertation I was going to do. And my mentor kept talking about how he thought what I should be doing for my dissertation is the definitive book on coal policy in America. If someone in those days were to ask me, would I rather do a dissertation on coal policy or get poked with a sharp stick, my response would have been, well, just how sharp is that stick? I mean, and so I was really, really nervous about this. Well, at about the time, I had to get serious, a bunch of Yahoo cowboys out in Nevada started kicking up their heels and set off the Sagebrush Rebellion. And so I went to Foss and I said, well, Foss, I mean, are you paying attention to this? Right? I think that might be a good dissertation topic. And it turns out Foss's book dealt with what is now referred to as one of the earlier Sagebrush Rebellions back in the 40s. And so Foss said, well, yeah. It's one of the reasons that I have a warm place in my heart for the Sagebrush Rebels, even though I don't really agree with them. And unbeknownst to them, they saved me from what I thought was a fate worse than death book about coal policy. I don't mean to offend if some of you really like coal. But, so that was one thing. But equally important is I started poking around with my early research. It occurred to me, let's see, this is backwards, yeah. Right? I mean, you can all see that. Well, you see, I'm an old anti-war protester. And what started taking shape in my thinking about the Sagebrush Rebellion is sort of an empathetic connection. As an anti-war protester, I understood exactly what it was like to be in a situation in which you thought your government was doing something wrong, right? But you couldn't get your government to pay attention to you. I mean, I grew up, essentially a solid middle-class Midwestern background. Hell, I'm an Eagle Scout. I have the God and Country Award from the Boy Scouts. And I remember my very first protest, thinking, well, this was going against everything that I had been taught all my life. But what I understood is that I thought the country was going down a very wrong path, and no one would seem to be willing to listen, and so protest was sort of a court of last appeals. that became my interest with the sagebrush rebels. Once again, I don't agree with them, never have, okay? Other than I have that empathetic connection. Now, I did send, I don't know if any of you read it, a little piece I wrote for our environmental studies operation here at Wyoming, right? About the Mahler Wildlife Refuge thing and me being asked to be a witness for the defendants. Right? Well, and so, you know, that piece I think helps explain what I'm talking about here. Is I got called in, right, because I understood why these people felt compelled to do this kind of stuff, even though I didn't agree with them. Right? Now, interestingly enough, and keep this, I don't know, there's quasi-confidentiality. I'm just kidding. Don't panic. But after the judge at the Mahler trial, you know, told me I had failed my audition, I went out to a bar with some of the lawyers for the defendants. See, all of the defendants in the wildlife refuge, except one, all their lawyers were public defenders. Right? And almost all of them knew nothing about federal land policy at all, right? Or politics and what have you. But anyway, so afterwards, we're sitting around at a bar talking about it. And this issue of empathy, I pushed them a little bit on it. Okay, are you ready for this? One of the lawyers for a very devout Christian woman was a self-identified radical feminist lesbian. Okay. Another lawyer was Mormon. Two other lawyers were Jews. Okay. And so what we talked about in the bar is that experiential connection. Right? I mean, these are all folks in one way or another who have been target of discrimination and target of government action, whether or not, you know, you agree with any of it. And so that's really what my interest in federal land politics has been about all along, is this politics side, right? And specifically the radical politics side. Now, I'm kind of wandering here, but stay with me. You'll see how this connects. So I said that John and I, my research paths had kind of diverged more recently. Well, this helps explain why. See, John remained more interested in federal land politics, and I have been working more with, well, today we call it right-wing populism. The right-wing populist movement, including Trump and the Tea Party and what have you. You see, all of those people, what we now call right-wing populism, right, they were major players, and the ideas were major political concepts of the Sagebrush Rebellion. And when I was working on my book, it occurred to me that there was something more going on in this federal land politics, the Sagebrush Rebellion thing, than simply grumpiness about, you know, bunnies and trees, as I used to call them. Right? And, well, I guess I was right. I mean, one reason I think right-wing populism is connected to federal lands is because federal lands provides, in their minds anyway, concrete examples for, I'll say the tyranny of the federal government. Right? You know, a lot of this rhetoric is kind of abstract and what have you, but, you know, ranchers being told what they can and can't do tends to provide a bottom to the politics for these people. Now, once again, that doesn't mean they're right, but I think that's one of the reasons that they were together, right? And of course, some of it has changed. Orrin Hatch of Utah was one of the leaders of the Sagebrush Rebellion back in the day. Interestingly enough, Last time he ran for re-election in Utah, the Tea Party folks targeted him because they thought that Orrin Hatch was no longer conservative enough. I don't know, right? But then again, you know, John and I used to talk about Boise a little bit, about Wyoming. See, in Wyoming, for instance, everywhere else in the country, you have party identification. You know, it's a continuum with Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other side, and you kind of pick someplace in between. Well, see, here in Wyoming, our party identification goes from sort of Republican to real Republican, right? Even the Democrats, well, the head of the state Democratic Party one day heard her interviewed on the radio saying, well, what the Democrats in Wyoming have to do is explain to folks that Wyoming Democrats are not like national Democrats. And she was on the radio. I talked to the radio. I talked to my TV too. I said, yeah, right? Wyoming Democrats have to convince people in Wyoming the Wyoming Democrats are just actually sort of Republicans after all. Okay? But in any event, party doesn't seem to play into any of this stuff, right? Though, you know, that's a convenient issue now. You know, Republicans are anti-environmentalists, Democrats are pro-environmentalists, but yeah, historically, that doesn't make sense. I mean, back in the 60s, one of the major confrontations, I talk about this in my book, were between a fellow by the name of Stuart Udall, who was then Secretary of Interior, and a fellow by the name of Wayne Aspinwall, who was the representative from the 3rd Congressional District of Colorado. Back in those days, that was essentially the northern third of the state of Colorado. Both of them were Democrats. Okay. But Stuart Udall, right, was, well, we'll call him an environmentalist, and Wayne Aspinwall was, well, we would call him a sagebrush rebel today. Right? And so party doesn't work. To some extent, ideology does work, right? Depending upon how we define ideology. But in any event, these are the kinds of things that I scratch my heads about, and I've been working recently. John and I used to. John had a contract from the University Press of Kansas. You know, after his first book, which was pretty popular, right? So the Kansas folks gave him a contract to publish a second book. That book has never been published. John and I used to talk about it. He would get, about once a year, he would get a letter from the University Press of Kansas saying, so how's the book coming along? And he'd write back and, oh, well, you know, I mean, academic publishing is a little bit different than private publishing. See, private publishing, they do things like give you a cash advance, right, to work on your book. Academic presses don't do that. They just give you a contract saying, yeah, well, you know, when you get your book done, we'll publish it. So they have nothing laid out up front, so they don't care. So John never did finish that second book. I bring this up because I don't like using the term book. I started to say I was working on a book. I call it a hobby. I'm working on a hobby, right? Because that's pretty much how I mean, you guys know what hobbies are like, right? I mean, you know, you have a hobby, right? And every now and then you get it down off the shelf and go crazy with it. And then you get bored and you put it back up on the shelf and ignore it, right? Until, oh, you know, a couple of years later, oh yeah, and get it down again. Well, that's my writing life mostly. But it's piecing together this right-wing movement. And I think it's fascinating myself. And there's pieces of it I don't understand. The biggest piece I don't understand is the global aspect. See, I can put together a pretty good yarn of how this right-wing populism stuff came to power in the United States. Right? But trying to get my mind around how it could become a global phenomenon, and it's not just Europe, South America, etc. I think it's a fascinating question, and I'm still scratching my head about it. I mean, I have some speculations, right? But it does have to do with the way we think about government. Okay? Well, in any event, let me back up. The other piece that Mackenzie and Emily picked for you guys to read, the history of federal land policy, I think is a pretty good summary. So there's no need for me to go through that too much, except I do want to make a couple of points about it, looking at this historically. First, we've been arguing about what we now call the federal lands in this country. I'm sorry. I've got a friend who slaps my wrist every time I use that term, we. Anglo-Americans have been arguing about land in North America for 200 plus years. Right? That led me and John to conclude that, we're probably never going to see the end of arguments over the federal lands. Right? Yeah, but does that mean we're just stupid? Well, no. See, my take would be that the original controversy, and the piece you read didn't go into quite enough detail here. See, the original controversy was what were then called the Western Territories. What do we know? Right? Which, was sort of the upper Ohio area. Right? See, and it was disputed land, primarily New York and Virginia argued about the Western Territories, who owned it. And so the question was, what was going to happen to that land if the Revolutionary War succeeded? And there were some other states, Maryland predominantly, who was excluded, had no connection to the Western Territories. Well, anyway, it stalled the adoption of the Articles of Confederation for several years, this argument over what to do with the Western Territories. In fact, the Articles of Confederation, which was the first national government in this country, wasn't officially ratified until I think it was about 6 months prior to the end of the Revolutionary War. Even though the Articles of Confederation were put together almost a month after the Declaration of Independence was adopted. So it was a long, drawn-out controversy. The resolution was, Thomas Jefferson and Al Hamilton, representing New York and Virginia, came up with the idea, the agreement, that the states would cede the Western Territories to the national government. But the actual compromise, or the actual political posture, was that the federal lands were to be used by the national government for the benefit of the nation. I'm going to argue here, as I've done elsewhere, that basic agreement struck back in the late 1700s is a pretty good rudder for understanding what most of the arguments about federal lands in this country have been about ever since. The problem here, analytical problem, is that benefit is one of those squirrely words. It can be defined in a lot of different ways. And that then becomes a way of thinking about what these arguments have been about, pardon me, in sort of a big picture sort of way. Right? I mean, right? See, during the Homestead era, right, at least for, sorry, I'm famous around Wyoming for a term, the University of Wyoming for a term I'm about to use, so don't be offended. Understand, I have a grin on my face. Right? The Homestead Act, at least for Euro villains, right, was serving the benefit of the nation. Right? The notion was the nation was going to be benefited if Euro villains spread across the continent. Moreover, at that time, the dominant social order in this country was agrarian. And so farming was the dominant thing. Homestead Act, right? I see some puzzle. Okay. Earlier on in my career, reading all this stuff, and especially environmental literature that explained how North America was this kind of paradise until Europeans came over, and it's been going to hell in a handbasket ever since, or however we get to hell now that we don't actually use handbaskets anymore. I don't know, going to hell with plastic Walmart shopping bags or something. Anyway. And so I figured just cut to the chase, and so I coined the term Euro villains. But in any event, it made sense, at least to the Euro villains. Now, of course, to our indigenous people, it didn't make as much sense. But to Euro villains, it made a great deal of sense. The conservation movement, which begins emerging in the late 1800s, the early 1900s, right, is taking place against the backdrop of a shift from an agrarian society to an industrial society. That shift in society then also leads to a different definition of what constitutes national benefit. Right? You know, one good indicator here, as near as I can tell, in terms of federal policy, it was not until the late 1800s that the term natural resources gets introduced into the conversation. So prior to that time, all the argument was land policy. But by the late 1800s, early 1900s, suddenly now policymakers are talking about natural resources, conservation of natural resources. And land then is reconfigured, re-territorialized, if you will. And see, prior to that period of time, land policy meant everything. Right? I mean, there's some details here, but basically, if you patented a homestead, you got the surface rights, you got the trees, you got the water, you got the minerals underneath. Right? Now that changed over time, right? But by the time we move into, pardon me, what's called the conservation era, land is now just one among many different kinds of resources. Is this making sense, what I'm saying? Words coming out of my mouth? Right, okay. That's one of the problems with Zoom is you can't tell exactly. Right? And so that's continued to today. Right? And we talk about resources. Right? Recreation is defined as a resource. John Muir used to talk about it that way. I mean, his famous book, Our National Parks, has the great line about wilderness being a place where tired, nervous, over-civilized people can go to get rid of their rust and disease. Recreation, right? Recreation is pretty much what John Muir was talking about. The Wilderness Act by 1964 also talks about recreation as a resource. Right? So we talk the shift, and all of the resources make sense because they define an industrial society. And so conservation, redefinition of resources, right, is consistent with what's considered in the benefit of the nation. Well, once again, I could go on and on. I see that you have, I see some questions here. So let me make one other point, and then we'll go into question and answer. Is that cool? Because I actually work better question and answer than just droning on by myself. The other piece I asked Emily McKenzie to share with you is a piece John and I wrote back in the early 90s with the title, Tree Farms, Mother Earth, and Other Dilemmas, the politics of ecosystem management in Yellowstone ecosystem. By the way, this is another wackiness about academic stuff, the obligatory colon. It is impossible to publish anything in the academic world that doesn't have a title with a colon in it. John and I wrote that piece, and originally we just wanted to call it Tree Farms, Mother Earth, and Other Dilemmas, because we thought that captured what the piece was about. And the journal editor said, well, yeah, we'd like to publish it, but you need a colon. And so it became the politics of ecosystem. Anyway, right? But I ask you to read that too. Because it's a good piece, but also just to demonstrate that John and I'm going to say this, and I'm not really bragging. I'm trying to be descriptive. That John and I actually were sort of on the cutting edge of this business. Because if you look at that piece, even though we didn't use this language, what we were introducing into the more or less standard public policy discourse about federal lands were a couple of concepts that now everybody uses. Okay? The first one would be social construction, this whole notion of social construction of nature. I mean, that's what we were trying to capture with Tree Farms versus Mother Earth. There's this basic notion that nature itself is something that we humans define, and we can define it in many different ways. But then the other thing we're doing in that piece is another thing that's, the big fad these days in a variety of areas is discourse analysis. See, what we were doing is saying, well, let's listen to how these people talk to each other, which is, rudimentary discourse analysis. Now, there are all sorts of folks, McBeath and others, who, like to try and put it into numbers and all sorts of things. But basically, discourse analysis is just, well, as I like to explain to my students, is developing a skill to listen not only to what people are saying, but how they are saying it. Because it's how the phrases and things they use, that's what reveals what kind of values are at play. Okay? And so, interestingly, that piece, when it first came out, didn't, shall we say, set off seismic events in the academic things, but it's been getting some more airplay later on, right? But John and I were looking ahead, trying to figure out, right, a way to talk about this stuff that involved not just greedy ranchers versus tree hugging hippies. That's involved there, but we thought much more was going on. Oh, shit. Let me make one last point. Back to my interest in right-wing politics, because this pertains to you guys right there in Idaho. This curious fellow named Almond Bundy. Okay. See, now a lot of folks think he's gone wacky because he was this sagebrush rebel, wildlife refuge occupier, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But more recently, he's come out in support of Black Lives Matter. And, well, you know, the anti-mask movement, that kind of stuff. Well, I'm going to suggest to you, I'm not surprised at all. Right? And this gets back to what I've been working on the last few years. Right? See, it's not just federal lands. It's a whole notion about what government should do or shouldn't do that animates it. And in that regards, Almond's connection with Black Lives Matter and even the anti-mask stuff is all perfectly consistent. As he just believes, right, the government shouldn't do a hell of a lot, which is a tradition that goes all the way back to the anti-federalists. But anyway, okay, so let me see if these questions are for me.
I've been looking them over, Greg, and if you'd like, I can synthesize and put a couple of them together, and I want to applaud the students for some excellent ones here. So there's one thread that goes in here that asks about, and this is combining Stephanie's first question with, I think, Daniel and Chris's. Well, so this idea that public resistance to federal to federal management as being a distrust of the government rooted in particular cultures. So is that distrust sort of predictable, to combine a couple of the questions? And is it something that could be expected in perhaps future situations? So one of the questions asks is if that's the case with wildfires. Like, might we expect there to be increased rebellion and resistance against federal management because of the increase of wildfires? And then another question asks, you know, is it something that could be predictable based on the influence of the Mormon religion in Utah, for example?
Good. No, that's a good question. Yeah, I'm laughing. I got interviewed by a journalist. I'm going to take the last part of the question first. I got interviewed by a journalist who raised the question about why is Utah always the center of these conflicts, and whether it was somehow connected to Mormonism. And I really don't have a good answer for that. I mean, if you know anything about the history of the LDS Church, they would prefer to be referred to as LDS rather than Mormon these days. You know, they have long-standing animosity with the federal government. You know, back in mid-1800s, the United States Congress passed a law making polygamy illegal in the territories. That's the only time the federal government has ever made any kind of religion in this country illegal. Moreover, the governor of Missouri at one point did in fact issue an executive order dispatching troops to, quote, kill Mormons in Missouri, right? So, I mean, culturally, historically, I think there's that kind of animosity, you know, kind of animosity between LDS folks and government in general. Whether that plays into federal lands, I don't know, right? But is this stuff predictable? Well, I think it is, right? See, the argument I made in my book about the Sagebrush Rebellion is that contrary to what all the rhetoric was about, you know, transferring the federal lands to the states, blah, 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 or giving the federal lands back to the states, silly argument, anyway. No, that's not what it was really about, right? It was about management and what we see as acceptable and unacceptable management And the Sagebrush Rebellion struck me as largely a reaction to the notion that, well, let's call them environmentalists, had developed more influence in federal policy, right? Preservation kinds of things. Right? See, that, by the way, would be a connection to what I'm thinking about right-wing populism more generally. Right? In this country, at least, I think one of the reasons right-wing populism re-emerged actually, pretty much for the same reason. It's a measure of how much our society has changed. See, I mean, coming through the turbulence of the 60s, we did go through all sorts of change in our society. Maybe not as much as we should have in terms of race politics, gender politics, etc. But I guarantee you, my friends, the America that I live in today is a fundamentally different America than I lived in when I was 10 years old. I grew up in a family in which racial slurs were common, right? We don't see much of that now. Well, all right, so that change has occurred, whether we're talking about it in terms of society or federal land policy, and the people who we'll call sagebrush rebels or right-wing populists, whatever you want to call them, are simply opposed to those changes. And so I think that's the pattern that explains it, which is predictable. To put it in more abstract terms, think about it this way. It seems to me, I mean, I mentioned before that one theme of federal land policy, broad theme, is that the federal lands are supposed to be used for the benefit of the nation. But, our definition of the benefit of the nation changes. Well, I think if you think about it, it's at those moments when our definition of what constitutes the benefit of the nation changes, which leads to changes in management regimes, right, that triggers these sagebrush rebellions over time. Right? So in that regard, yes, it's predictable. Wildfire is curious, right? I mean, on the one hand, I'm going to continue to call them sagebrush rebels, right? Are very much in favor of stopping fires because, after all, they see trees as timber, tree farms, right? And so, yeah, I mean, so did Gifford Pinchot, right? He saw forest fires as, interestingly, John and I used to talk about this. Go back and read old Gifford Pinchot, the founder, or at least one of the big voices of the early conservation movement, on this fire stuff. I mean, he hated fire, in part because the last time we had serious catastrophic forest fires out here in the West was back in 1910. Right? Now, count on your fingers here, kids. The Forest Service was started in 1905, and the Park Service was started in 1915, and we went through an episode of catastrophic fires in 1910. So the notion that the reason we're going through catastrophic fires now is because of 100 years of fire suppression policy by federal agencies doesn't work very well to describe the 1910 forest fires. Right? And if you do the science, there are some scientists out there who argue that catastrophic fire is perhaps part of the ecosystem, which is what I'm badly trying to get to. You go back and read Gifford Pinchot, and Gifford Pinchot would say things like, well, in the past, the reason we didn't do anything about forest fires is because everybody thought they were acts of God. But says Pinchot, we now have science, so we can fight those fires. Okay. Well, all right, acts of God, part of the natural ecosystem, strike me as relatively similar kinds of terms. And so we've come, in a sense, full circle here, right? And now we accept the fire as the natural process. And I think that then is where some of the conflict comes about, right? I mean, it's this notion, you know, in their best moments, really, I mean, sagebrush rebels are old-time conservationists, old-time a la Gifford Pinchot. Right? And so, yes, they want to stop fires, and so where their grumpiness is going to be is with this controlled burn stuff. You know, that fire is a natural part of the ecosystem. By the way, you know, one more point here, and then let's move on. This is also something John and I talk about in that piece I asked you to read. Just what the hell is an ecosystem? See, think about it. Bambi, you familiar with the movie Bambi? Well, see, control or wildfires play out differently for Bambi than they do for modern ecology, right? I mean, you know, big forest fire in Bambi killing friends and parents, right? Well, I mean, this is part of the problem with an ecosystem. See, fire makes sense, perhaps ecologically, if all we're talking about is trees, the forest as the ecosystem, right? But when we put the wildlife question into it, well, then controlled burn makes a little bit less sense. In fact, a fellow by the name of Aldo Leopold, who's a big name in this environmental business, wrote a book called Game Management back in 1920s, early 30s, right? And in there, he identified forest fires as one of the major problems for managing wildlife. Now, although Leopold was also a graduate of the Yale Forestry School, I've been able to verify this, but I'm willing to put some money, quite a bit of money, not the farm, but quite a bit of money on the possibility that although Leopold probably sat in some lectures by Giff Pinchot when he was in the forestry school. And the time lines up. So, but yeah, I think these things are predictable. You know, and well, Phil Brick and I also have a piece I thought about sending you, but think about it. Trying to hook all of this stuff into, you know, more or less standard politics, party politics, you know, Republicans bad guys, Democrats good guys, as it were, from an environmental perspective. Again, it doesn't pay attention to all the changes that have come about. Sorry. So Republicans get elected, and environmentalists go, oh, end of the world, end of the world, end of the world. Then Democrats get elected, and environmentalists go, world saved, and then Republicans get elected. Back and forth, you know, so like a pendulum back and forth, right? Well, but really, most of the policies, environmental policies, have remained pretty solid out there. Okay? Yeah, we've made some adjustments here and there, right? But I don't know if you saw the news. Our president, right, who on the one hand is trying to convince people we should drill for oil in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, either yesterday or today, extended a 10-year ban on offshore oil drilling. Right? Now, obviously, you know, he's trying to make himself appear to be more of an environmentalist, right? But environmentalism has become deeply embedded in our culture. When I got my PhD, right? Environmental politics, I mean, I applied to all sorts of places. I said, what the hell is this environmental politics crap? I mean, real political scientists don't do that kind of stuff. But now, the American Political Science Association job newsletter has a category called environmental politics, right? in their job lister. Right? Those are real changes that have occurred in our society. I don't know. Does that answer the question for those of you who posed the question? Is that what you were looking for? Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. Okay.
Let me try and synthesize a couple other ones
Okay.
too, because I think that put together a number of them. And then we'll have a couple minutes and students who have lingering questions that haven't been answered could pipe up and ask themselves. So there were a number of questions that I'm going to combine here. Shannon's neat question with Stephanie and Tess, who picked up on your comment that the intelligent conversation often happens after the panel or after the conference and in the bar. And so students are wondering why you think that is, and also can that continue to happen in our current sort of virtual situation? And if so, could you talk a little bit about how you've been influenced by working or communicating with groups that you didn't necessarily agree with to start, and are maybe those things connected?
Okay, that's good. Let me start with the bottom. Okay. Once again, okay. I got invited, to back in the day to address people like the Wyoming Livestock Association, all these sagebrush groups who were familiar with my book. You should have seen the look on their faces when I actually walked in the room. Because they'd look up at me and go, well, he's a goddamn hippie. Right? Interestingly enough, I got very few invites to talk to environmental groups. Even though, if you read, one of the things I'm most proud about in terms of my book is the blurb on the jacket of the book written by a guy named Roderick Nash. Right? I mean, he has a very nice blurb. He understood exactly what my book was about, right? So yeah, it's always fun to talk to groups that are different than yours. It's mostly environmentalists over the years reacted to my book as I said earlier, that I'm a closet sagebrush rebel, and apologizing for these folks, but that's because, well, they're intense in their beliefs, I'm going to say. So why does stuff happen mostly in the bars? Well, a couple of reasons, I think. I don't know your experience, Emily, or Mackenzie, if you've been in the conference thing. But at one level, these conferences are just damn silly things. You spend, 6 months writing a 20-page paper, and at a good conference, you get maybe 15 minutes to present your paper. Right? A long time ago, people first starting out really trying to cram their entire paper into 15 minutes. I gave that up a long time ago and adopted the attitude, well, it's kind of, the journalist attitude where they put the big quotes in the middle of an article hoping to get your attention. Right? You see that quote, oh, and then you're going to read the article. Well, that's when I do conference presentations anymore. That's pretty much what I do. I like to say some outrageous things and then say, now, okay, that pisses you off, go read my paper. You get the details. So that's one of the reasons that the panel sessions themselves are usually non-productive. But the other thing is, pretty much these conferences bring together people who live in all sorts of different places and who don't see each other much. Okay? And so it's face-to-face contact. Right? But, the media is different. Quite frankly, I spent more time talking to John Freemuth over email than I've spent talking to my colleagues in the, we're in the School of Politics, Public Affairs, and International Studies, which our head says is the acronym is SPICE. I have no idea how she got that, but we used to be a political science department. I spent more time talking to John on email in my office than I would talk to flesh and blood people right there in the meeting. Another issue here related is a lot of us, I mean, John's in a little bit better, was in a little bit better position than I am here because Boise's a little bit bigger school, but see, I work in a very small department, and really there's none of my colleagues who are, at least in terms of environmentalism and federal land politics, are working in that area. So I really don't have much in the way of folks to talk to here. Right? But so when I get to go to a conference, then, you know, I'm with my people, as it were. Right? And then finally, right, after, I don't know, first gen, you know, all the jockeying and ego stuff kind of gets set aside most of the time because there's a lot of that goes on in academic conferences, right? I mean, egos and who's right and who's wrong. I was at a conference, Sally Fairfax, who's a big name in this business, gave a paper and she went after me pretty seriously, disagreement. And afterwards she took me aside and said, well, Greg, this is how conferences work. You present a paper, I attack you, you defend yourself. And I said, Sally, no. My conference papers are simply my thinking on an issue at that moment. I mean, there's nothing to defend there. Right? And I've got a ton more conference papers than I have publications. Because sometimes, you know, I do a paper, see how it goes, and go, yeah, okay, I guess that doesn't work. Sometimes I get bored, right? But when you get into the bar, by the way, Sally was one of the reviewers of my book for Kansas. I got a telephone call from the editor at Kansas saying, well, we just got Sally's comments back and we've just sent it to you. In those days, it was actually paper. And I had to mail this box of my manuscript, which was all on paper, and it came back to me with editorial comments on the side. And anyway, the Kansas editor said, so when it gets there, Greg, before you open it, sit down. And I said, well, okay. So I opened it up and looked through. Here are the kinds of editorial comments Sally Fairfax offered for me on my book. Horse shit, bullshit. Literally, that's what she would write. Circle something and over in the margin, horse shit. So I got back to the editor and I said, well, you know, Sally and I, you know each other. And I said, so basically what's really going on here is there's some issues she and I are never going to agree on. There's some issues that she caught me on that I'll change. And there's some issues that she's just flat out wrong about and I'm not going to change. And the editor went, whew, right? But sitting around in a bar, usually, most of that kind of ego stuff goes away. Or more specifically, you know, the people who get together around the table at the bar, right, are people of equal egos. The other ego assholes are over at the other table, right? But it also provides an opportunity to just sit around and you know, speculate. You don't have to prove anything, and you can try out ideas, see how they work, and push each other. And does it work better? I don't know. I mean, I've had some meetings. Most of these places now are going to this virtual conference because of this pandemic stuff. And I haven't had that opportunity. So I don't know if it works or not. I mean, I've had some meetings with folks and, you know, I mean, it's just like this, right? I mean, yeah, but it's at the same time stilted a bit. I mean, usually, you know, a bunch of college professors sitting around talking are more talkative than you guys are. But I think it can be done. I mean, John and I used to know. One of the things I really regret is that I didn't save, oh my God, there must have been thousands of pages of emails that John and I shared with each other. And you know, when I heard about his death, I checked and I was able to save some, but I got rid of all sorts of them a long time ago. And, you know, I mean, some of it was about academic stuff, but a lot of it was about, you know, did you hear the Dylan's new bootleg? And John talking about going to see Van the Man in Vegas. That's one of the problems with this electronic stuff, by the way. The stuff does disappear. You know, back in the days when people used to write letters to each other, it could disappear, but it was less likely to disappear. But in this electronic age, it just poof, and it's gone. So, but I think there's still room for it. Right? But I like to remind folks these days that I'm perfectly comfortable. My location on the downside of the evolutionary curve, which means however we plot my future from this point on, it pretty much ends at the same place. John just got there a little bit before I did. But the upside that we don't talk as much about is I don't have to worry about adaptation. Adaptation is a young critter's concern. Right? I mean, dinosaurs, right? Brontosaurus? Well, shit. I ain't going to adapt to this. So, I'm sorry.
Well, it definitely feels like we're in one of those punctuated equilibrium moments, right? When the adaptation is forced upon us and it's not necessarily a choice, but I think these.
Yeah. My concern in that regards, I was just talking to my seminar last night about it. There's an old public administrator by the name of John Goss who was talking about social change and how catastrophe, right? Well, see, I think what we're going through right now is what he was talking about. I think this is the future. I mean, right now we're talking about this kind of a format as, you know, dealing with the catastrophe, the pandemic. But I think what's going on here is we've got all sorts of forces at work to say that this is going to be the future of higher education, this format. I spent an hour in a Zoom with some consultants hired by the University of Wyoming who are trying to convince me to get excited about all of this digital stuff. Felt like being trapped in a room. I don't mean to step on toes here. Being trapped in a room with 5 used cars salespeople. That was terrible.
Well, I do hope what comes out of it is we see a renewed value in the face-to-face piece, even if we also see the possibilities of the virtual stuff.